So the the background to this, I think, before I probably give you my thoughts, is maybe I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves first, and then we'll get into what stuff about who you are, what you eat, that thing.
Hello, my name is Eric Roberg. You heard me before. I'm chairman of TISPA. I own and operate an ISP in mostly in Arusha, but now we're in 5 cities in Tanzania. And I was a technical person, but the last 5 years I'm more in management.
Yeah, my name is Ben Roberts. I'm Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at Liquid Telecom. I also was a technical person, but the last 5 years I've been more management. So.
Hi, my name is Ernest. I'm here to represent EANOG. I am a network engineer and trainer. And yes, I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Andrew again. As you know, with Terraco Data Environment, you ask what we eat, and it's like incredibly difficult. I also just want to point out to everybody that Mark again didn't send us any of the questions beforehand, just so keep that in mind when you give answers.
Yes, that's how I do.
All right, so my name is John Gitao. I work at Cisco with the global service providers team, mainly working with the regional service providers.
Okay, excellent. So the question, should Africa stop investing in Europe, is one I'd like us to start thinking about as African operators, as African consumers of network services, content, infrastructure, and so forth. And the background that I'm coming with, and again, Andrew's right, I've not provided any questions to the panel, so they'll be speaking from the heart, is that, in regions where internet is now becoming more affordable, it's getting quicker, where you can now buy, a decent 4G, LTE, 3G package. You can buy a decent wireless or fiber package to your service, to your office or to your home, and what you could have only been able to spend on, say, half a meg or a meg, you can now afford to get maybe 100 meg or 500 meg or a gig or whatever. It seems that as we go forward, the bandwidth itself is no longer going to be a major constraint, particularly in markets, cities or countries where the internet is opened up. Obviously, where that hasn't happened, they have much larger problems. But for those that are, that's not going to be an issue anymore. The issue now is that all of us are consuming some kind of cloud, whether we know it or not, use some kind of cloud. And for the most part, those clouds are not in Africa, never mind in your own country. Those clouds are most likely in Europe, North America, maybe Asia, depending. So, if you went from having 2 meg to your home to having 500 meg to your home or to your office, one would expect, an order of magnitude jump in performance for your bandwidth. But if the cloud or the service that you're using is not sitting locally in Africa or in your country, then you're going to feel shortchanged when the performance you got at 10 meg is the exact same when you're getting at 1 gig, because the latency is now the problem. As we all know, if the latency is too high, the performance is bad. Simple as that. If you migrate your email service from a local email service provider in your country to a global one, that's selling cheap, and then suddenly you can't send the same attachment at the same speed as before, you blame the network provider, but the latency went up. The response then from the operators is to now go into Europe and set up more peering, deploy more POPs, get into more exchange points in Europe, get to Frankfurt, get to Amsterdam, get to London. Ben likes London. He was saying all of Africa loves London. His slide this morning was everything seems to point to London. If we all go and set up pubs in London, get more, Marseille or Palermo and so forth, how does that actually help Africa? If what we want is to cut the latency, but instead we are going as far as we can to sort of cut it on behalf of the owners of the content, what incentive do they have to come to Africa to drop the latency? Right now, some of you are my customers, for example. You call me every day and say, are you going to join this cable system to cut latency by 80 milliseconds to that gaming service in New York? How about if you say, gaming service, I'm buying services from you, come and deploy where your customers are? You know what I mean? If we keep building cable systems and building more infrastructure to go to Europe and North America and Asia Pac, when will they come in here to offer services locally? Bandwidth utilization in the US, in Europe is outrageous. It grows massively. The content is catching up. The content is always there to make it available easily to consume that bandwidth. Bandwidth in Africa is growing as well, but where's the content to match? So you have this disparity between availability of capacity to your home, but a lack of content to fully utilize that. And this is the background of the question. I should hand over to the panel for initial thoughts. Starting with John, you have the mic.
All right, so good afternoon or evening. I was told I'm suffering from jet lag. I came all the way from Kenya. But yeah, so for me, when I started thinking about this, which is, I mean, I've weighed on it on and off several times, but I think having an opportunity to look at this holistically with through a panel like this might bring some perspective. So for me, it's not so much what we could be, whether or not we are subsidizing. It's also other areas like what other services could we be launching locally? Which areas could we be innovating in? Were we to build most of this content or localized games or whatever it is? So I see a huge opportunity cost in what Mark is talking about, and I think I'm looking forward to engaging with the audience on how we can go about resolving some of these issues, assuming we all see them as an issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as Terraco, we get an opportunity to deal with a lot of international companies, just by virtue of what we do. Now, as Mark mentioned, the price of the bandwidth that we are buying has dropped significantly. If you think back a couple of years, it was impossible to do anything. This is obviously now a problem because now we have high speed capacity to our homes or to our mobile devices. So now it becomes more important, obviously. But I wonder if we've done this to ourselves. We can't just expect people to come to Africa because we are now ready for them or because we have sufficient capacity for them. And let's be honest, we haven't made it easy in the past for these things to happen. What we see with a lot of our international clients is the biggest difficulty they have is creating a business case to be in Africa. And I think in a lot of instances, that's why there is this slow phased approach to get onto the continent. And it is happening a lot faster than it used to, but it is still a bit of a wait. And I just want everybody to think about that. The most important bit is you need to create a business case. Nobody's going to come unless there is a business.
So when I think about this topic, I just think about the elections in Kenya in 2017, and how our elections were actually held in France. So the French government has more information about the citizenry of our country than the Kenyan government itself. So I wondered to myself, like, is it that we don't have the capabilities at home? Is it that we don't have the infrastructure, or is it the legislation that's not supporting the idea that we can finally have our own data centers, we can domicile our data within our borders and manage it ourselves? So as things change and the history of the internet comes to smack us in the ass, because initially the internet was in Europe, in the States, and we were connecting to the servers there. But now things are changing because Africa has content. Africa has people who are creating new things. So maybe this kind of conversation is just part of the process of us now transitioning into hosting our own stuff now. It's part of the process, I guess. So I'm excited about this conversation.
Look, firstly, I'm going to challenge you on the statement you made there, which is if Kenyan election information is hosted in Amazon Web Services in France, I don't think the French government have any access to Amazon Web Services, and they certainly wouldn't be hosting in France if the French government had access to that information. But really, for me, we're a company that started out in London. As Mark knows, I like London, but I'm here now, and we initially we grew, and before we expanded building fiber in Africa, we had a London office solely in London, and we just used satellite links into Africa. And now we have 100 employees in London. We have 2,300 employees in Africa. So we've completely changed from being a European startup to being an African-centered company. And for me, the question goes further than when Africa should stop investing in Europe, but actually, when should Africa start exporting to Europe? When should African content, African applications, African net businesses be exporting to Europe? And that really is the opportunity. A really good example, I think, was Kitepa Tea, and who are tea company from the Kenya Tea Development Board, and they put up a website for advertising their tea online, and suddenly their sales grew up. It's very simple things, and when we see more of that happening, more whether it be digital content, whether it be agricultural content, actually being used the internet to export to Europe, that is when we're making a difference.
I also, when Mark asked me to be on this panel, I was happy. And I'll give you some background. So I come from a much smaller organization than, say, like Ben's. But I've been in this business for 25 years. And over the years, the first time we bought a VSAT connection, 64 kilobits for $12,000 a month. And over a few years, you start seeing the price dropping drastically. You know that we were being sucked dry. And it continues. Like right now, the links between Africa and Europe, who pays for them? It's Africa. It's not the other way around. Another thought comes to my mind is we need to point ourselves, because especially I think in Tanzania, one thing I appreciate about South Africa is when we watch TV programs, we always see proudly South African. I think one thing we also have to start doing is we should choose to buy our services locally. Too many people, even if you get a business card from a government employee, they have their business email address, and then they also have their Gmail, and they tend to use the Gmail. That says something about, are you proud of your own country? And we are trying, all ISPs, if you look at their websites, including our own, we all advertise that we have data centers. Now, they're not like the big data center in Dar or in Nairobi, but we have data centers. It's a struggle to get people to start to trust us, saying, okay, I'll put my data at your center.
Thanks, guys. So many years ago, I think when peering was all the rage in Africa, and it was all about, where's the exchange points in Africa and so forth. And myself, Nishal, Michuki, a couple of yourselves as well, were doing workshops all over the place trying to preach exchange points. The question was always local content. And I think we quickly learned ourselves into a situation where we realized that the issue isn't really local content. The issue is localizing the content. There were suggestions that if content is in local language, it will boom. But in actual facts, most people love Netflix and it's not a local company, but the content is localized, Facebook, etc. Could the solution be to what Andrew was saying? Let's not sit, wait and hope for the best. Let's take matters into our own hands. There are a number of compute services you can buy locally in Africa. There are a number of cloud services you can buy locally in Africa, over the top. Why aren't these being chosen as opposed to the big name brands that don't collocate locally? And, are we saying that there's an opportunity here now for an African CDN, an African Akamai that understands Africa, that can come in and say, you know what, let me localize all this global content into Africa since I can do it quicker and faster. And in fact, as Ben was saying, perhaps take those CDNs to Europe and distribute the African services. Is that what we need to get this thing going faster? Who wants to go first?
I'm holding one. So Ernest and I mean, we worked about quite a bit on the whole elections thing, and it was quite interesting to observe. But there's also the impact on other areas, culture, business. And I'm actually right now trying to figure out, is there a governance issue? How is it that we are able to bring on board all this fiber, but for some reason we are not able to? I mean, I believe there's a lot of content coming out of Africa. It's just going to the other side of the ocean. And then we are consuming it from that side back into Africa. When I look at what we are doing with things like AI as an example, could we be using this to try and localize some of, I mean, I wouldn't mind watching a movie from India, but somehow getting it translated to Swahili. But the question is, where is it? Is it getting cached, locally? So in the end, for me, if we are going to solve this particular problem, I think it would be interesting to see how we handle that whole governance. How do we attract? So it's one thing to say, let's attract the Amazons and the CDNs coming from the other side, but there's also, how can we build them locally and ensure that our people are consuming from this? Is there a trust issue, which sounds like there's quite a bit of that. I don't trust Node Africa as much as I, let's say, trust Office 365 or I don't know.
I think, Mark, that there are two issues. Obviously, for a long time, when people spoke about local content, it was a very misunderstood concept. And a lot of people thought that it meant that we had to produce content to make all of this work. And of course we do. But that's a separate issue. And I don't think that has anything to do with the peering. Sorry, I'm getting accustomed to this mic. Those are two different issues. And why do we use the name brand services? And I think it's because it's all we know. That is just what we know. We know who the cloud providers are. We know who the streaming services are. Why are we not doing the same thing? And in certain cases we are, as mentioned, we are generating content on the continent. But, it's what are we doing with that content? We seem to expect that simply because we create this content, everybody's going to want to see it. And that's not always the case. So we shouldn't see that as a target. And again, I think it is possibly a different issue. The internet is global, right? We shouldn't try and regionalize content. Obviously the content that people consume in Africa you would expect is going to be different. But you want to have access to everything. The internet is global.
I'll use the example of email for the government employees and how they have their local email and they have the Gmail. And just recently, we are hosting with Safaricom, who's a local provider, and we do our email through them. And we've had a lot of challenges with email, which is something that you wouldn't imagine to have today. So we are this close to actually moving to another host, DreamHost, or someone who's out there because of the efficiency and the uptime. However much we want to support local, sometimes local will disappoint. And maybe it's just a function of evolution, like they still have to go through the process of learning and being better at what they do. But this could be a key challenge when you're talking about adoption, because it's real. If you're having outage on your email because you're hosting locally, then it's impacting on business. So you want to be able to have good uptime. You want to move out there and host somewhere else. So this could be one of the possible reasons why we're not adopting our local infrastructure, because it's still new and it's still fresh, so it still has its problems.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, the design standards and the real hard engineering that goes into designing a Microsoft or a Google or an AWS data center cluster is just so much more advanced than anything anybody in Africa is doing it, whether it be an MNO like Safaricom or an ISP like Eric has got. You know, you're just not in the same league of the scale and engineering. But all the, you know, there is some content being created, but it is all getting, you know, then uploaded and hosted to global platforms. So, you know, if you're a musician, you're probably pushing it up to YouTube or Vimeo. If you are a game developer, you're pushing up onto Android or App Store. You know, and that then is creating an immediate challenge, because the preferred method of paying for anything online or paying for anything small in Africa, most of Africa, is going to be mobile money, and the platforms that the African content developers are pushing all their content up to mostly are not taking mobile money. So that the real opportunity, what Mark said around having, you know, creating African CDNs, creating we're creating some different platforms ourselves for different applications. The obvious way to go forward is to make it accessible to mobile money from the beginning. Therefore, you don't keep out your local market. So your African content creators are pushing it onto a platform that doesn't really make it accessible to their own home market. That's a problem, isn't it? And so that is what is needed to grow that. It might then make these platforms wake up and invest in mobile money integration. But you know, that's really the opportunity.
Typically, I think I have more questions than I have solutions. And I see, which might be a good thing. I see there's two areas that we're trying to address in terms of local content. And one is the business community's data and programs and file server. And you know, we get a few people to come on, but I think it goes down to, well, these guys, like Ben said, they're a bit smaller, you know, and who do you trust? You want to trust Google or do you want to trust Habari? Well, I think people should start opening up, and I think it's starting to come that people are starting to say, oh, maybe we don't want to put our stuff out there. You know, maybe we'd rather, we know Eric, he's kind of a local guy, and I think it's coming. And the latency, just now, I was looking at my calendar. It happens to be in our data center, and even from here, it was, you know, it was good. Whereas Google would have been a bit slower. The second one is when you're trying to sell something, and I think maybe what I look at in Tanzania is maybe we don't have a big enough pool to monetize it. I know it was the news, the young guy in Arusha has started online music selling, but he's told me that he just can't make money on it. Is it because we have too small of a market, or we need some more gimmicks or better content? I don't know.
I'd like to open up the floor at this time. Let's engage. Obviously, Michelle. Who else joined? Yeah, okay.
I wasn't clear. Was that obviously Nishal?
Obviously, you had to be the first.
Yes. Nishal Govardhan, Packet Clearinghouse. Thank you. Interesting discussion. I have a bunch of questions and perhaps some comments. I guess my first question is, in thinking as an ex-techie, since most of you on the stage are techies, one of the concepts we get very familiar with when we start is hot potato routing, right? And how hot potato routing helps to share costs when you set up interconnection between two networks. How much of that is a problem right now? You're talking a lot about content. Everyone's spoken about content, but nobody has spoken about why is there not a big network from whether it's Europe, the US, China, Japan, wherever. Why aren't these big networks in Africa peering and interconnecting in here? So is that an issue, or is that not an issue that we should be thinking about? So hot potato routing, anyone? Is that the cause of concern? How do we get it? Should we get it?
Well, we are, so what I mean is,
Really?
the number one ISP right now in Africa is not an African ISP, right? So we obviously are spending an inordinate amount of money to get to these global ISPs. If they were here investing in Africa, maybe, if that's what you're asking.
So, I mean, Eric, I think it was said this, who's paying for the email when you want to send mail to the UK? And I think the answer for me is obvious, I guess, because I've been doing this for a while as well, but we are paying for that. But if there was, and just for the sake of argument, a British Telecom peering equally at the KIXP, at the Johannesburg exchange points, at the Tanzanian exchange point equally, would this be more or less of a concern for us? And if they're not here, then what are we doing wrong? What are we not bringing them down? What are we not doing to bring them down here? Because they're happily taking our money in Europe, right? Or happily peering with us in Europe. I mean, I ran a network 10 years ago and BT was one of our peers.
Yeah,
Maybe we need to do what Uber's doing right now in Dar es Salaam is go on strike.
Don't even start with Uber and Dar es Salaam. Are they not doing hot potato routing? I mean, they're handing off at the nearest place, which isn't in Africa, which doesn't benefit us, it benefits them. But you're talking about the email situation specifically, and that particular email provider does have infrastructure in Africa. And so they're carrying that traffic. So it's not the same for everybody. Let's not pretend that the entire rest of the world is against us.
It's of the global network providers that have come to Africa, and there are a few who've put POPs in Africa and to get closer to people to Solemn IP transit. Of those, they don't have many customers connected on those POPs. So look at a company like Level 3. We pay a lot of money getting to London to connect to Level 3. Level 3 come to South Africa or even to Kenya. I don't believe they've got very many customers connected. So hot potato routing is probably a bit irrelevant because they don't have any customers connected in Africa.
So it would be more relevant if, and I guess my point, sorry, I want to do this with my hands. I guess I didn't make my point clearly because I'm used to explaining this on a whiteboard, but hot potato routing works for both parties when you share traffic across two locations. So where you pay the long distance part of maybe the send and they pay the long distance part of the transmit or your receive, in other words. Okay, so you want a situation like this where you're sharing costs equally on the long distance part. And we don't have that case right now. You're absolutely right. We have the Europeans all waiting for us or the Chinese or whoever, the Americans, waiting for us to build up into their corner of the world. So they're always paying the short distance link, the link into London, from London to London, or the link across Amsterdam to get to the local exchange there. What are we doing wrong to bring them in here? I hear you saying they don't have a lot of customers in South Africa, but the idea about, the customers in Africa, but the idea of peering is that you don't just advertise your customers in Africa. So is the problem perhaps that they're not advertising all of their services? Because if Level 3 was selling transit out of Dar es Salaam, I expect that they'll be able to provide you with a full routing table here, which is, or if you were big enough to peer with them, or perhaps it's not even the tier 1 operators. Perhaps it's the large tier 2 operators who are not as fussy, but willing to peer with you. Maybe that's what we should be targeting. I don't know, the Init7s and so of the world who will peer with you if you meet them at one of the big exchanges in Europe. And they need to be the ones that are convinced to come down and peer openly, because they'll do that at exchange points in Africa. How far would that go towards solving our problems?
Well, let me ask you this, Nishal. Do you think that asking the global providers to come and build in Africa will actually help Africa as such?
Oh, no, I was asking the panel.
Yeah,
are you asking me?
Yeah, same as well. Because their home network is not Africa, right? So while Ben is building a cable from Cape to Cairo, I don't know which one it was, British Telecom you mentioned, might just build one from London to Joburg, and that's it. That's Africa. So, and also for you, for the panel to think about.
So even as we think through this, traditionally how we solved most telecoms issues actually in the world has been through regulation. And what has been happening, at least in my opinion, is most regulators have always been behind when it comes to things IP, things transit, things peering, etc., etc. The risk I'm seeing here is we don't want a situation where they catch up now and all of a sudden start putting all this, because that's what would happen. They would come in and say, hey, listen, we expect you, Level 3, for instance, to come and peer here with Kenya. Anyone who's tried to do a lot of, and I believe we've all done business across Africa, it's not one country. The moment you land in Mombasa doesn't mean you've landed in Congo or Rwanda and these other places. But imagine a case where the Congolese government or regulator says, you know what, Level 3 must come to Congo. I'm trying to imagine that case, and I don't know. The question here is, what's the role of the regulator in answering some of these questions?
The answer is that what regulators can do to promote it, if they don't want to promote it, that's why they're not doing this, but is absolutely nothing, is stop regulating. And I started out in London, and if I wanted to put a POP into France, I don't need to do anything. I just call a data center and ask for space to put my router, and I order a circuit. If I want to go to Germany, I call the data center, and I don't need to open a company, get a local shareholder, a local board, or any of these other things, get a license and pay dues, USF fees, any of these other taxes. Don't need to do anything at all. So that is that then encourages networks to grow in an infinite, in lots of different permutations in North America and Europe. A bit more restrictive in Asia, a bit harder in South America, but Africa is the hardest. Africa, the requirements by regulators actually disencourage, and those companies that have built Pan-African networks or pan-global networks, we have to invest in those things. We have to invest in a staff and an office and a representative and a license, and it's expensive. And we don't want now, and we've paid money into these things and invested, we wouldn't like to see it being opened up. So, everybody just come for free. Don't invest the money that CCOM got to get a landing license. You can come for nothing. We wouldn't want to see that, because we've invested in supporting governments with those monies. So I don't necessarily think that the regulatory environment is or should change to encourage it.
Well, I think it should change. And this goes back to what I was saying, is we haven't made it easy. And we had this discussion last night about just getting equipment into even South Africa. We had a client with their kit sitting in customs for 18 months. And that's, that's revenue that we're missing out on. But at the same time, one of the networks that has been mentioned, being in South Africa, was actually never there. They effectively did a deal swap with one of the local providers, and then sold off of the brand name, the well-known brand name. And that's not ideal, obviously, because they're not bringing anything new. But at the same time, I still believe that is a method of building a business case, and it needs to make sense for them to build that infrastructure as much as we want it to happen. We certainly do want it to happen, and we want it to happen across the continent, not just in these regionalized hubs that we keep talking about.
Ernest, you look like you want to say something.
Not really.
Eric, the floor.
Thank you very much for your contributions. It seems to me that this is a problem that African operators need to take responsibility for trying to fix, because if it seems like it is something you have to leave for them to solve, it's not going to happen. I say this because Mark said earlier on that at low levels, when the bandwidth it's really low, we've got speed. And then you get to a point when just throwing more bandwidth at that problem isn't going to solve it. And obviously, most of us are getting to that point where, just more bandwidth isn't going to meet the expectations of the customer. I happen to remember Dell in the 1990s. It was Darling, was one of the best companies in the world. And essentially what Dell did was it started with low-end computers, sort of like, the crappy bandwidth that we sell in most African countries. And then slowly they got up market. One of the things that allowed them to do that was an unknown Taiwanese company, which started off by making chips and then motherboards. Every single time it would convince Dell, we can do this cheaper than you. And you can pass off the prices to your customers, and Dell will accept. Every time Dell accepted, it would write some things off its balance sheet, and its customers would get those lower prices. It got to a point around 2005 when this company essentially was Dell was nothing but a marketing company. This company created the brand ASUS and started competing with Dell. So simply because it was trying to optimize for something, cheaper prices to its customers, particularly for the short term, it ended up creating its own destruction. Is there a chance that perhaps by optimizing just for maybe speed and in the short term, African operators could be driving themselves into a similar situation?
I agree with what you've said. We also seem to be intimidated by international companies, and we seem to be afraid to want to have these kind of conversations. So I agree with that part of what you've said.
For me, I just feel like within the continent of Africa, we're very disorganized. I don't know if it's by design or it's just the nature of how things are now, but it's that disorganization that's causing all this complication. If we were to unify, for example, a lot of the rules and regulations, how people should connect to different parts of the continent, then it would make things a lot easier. But now, as it stands, every country has its own set of rules, which have their own implications and makes the barrier of entry very high for most people who want to connect. So I'm with John when it comes to regulating things, but unifying them so that it's just not as complicated as it is right now.
And Eric?
I'd like to go back what Ben said. I think we need less regulations. That now we're starting to hear there's going to be more fees for rights away. So it just adds the cost for even the local infrastructure.
Okay, so I've got a question. It's about three perspectives that have come around the solution. Is it a technology problem? Is it a market problem? Is it a regulatory problem? And what I would love to see is, look, we've got the SAFNOC here. There was an IWIC. There's an AFNOC. there's fora when people who are key stakeholders in this industry meet regularly. Is there a possibility that within yourselves you can start crafting some kind of a solution? Because then government would follow. Because we know from example like Celtel, the creation of Celtel as a telecommunications company on this continent, that really they led the way and government followed. Is it possible that it's something that we can do rather than just waiting for, the market or regulators or the West to fix it?
I think government will follow will follow very closely when they see you making money. And when you're making money, they turn up with a new tax.
Okay, so it's good Ernest has the mic because my next question is targeted at him.
Damn it.
Ernest, you said you're describing your mail solution. You said that the localized service wasn't relevant enough for you. And the immediate next example you spoke of was a brand that's off continent. Now, I'm a fan of Andrew. What Andrew said earlier on was that you should not necessarily try to regionalize content, as in like look at IACO, for example, or look at SADC or something like that. And I'm a fan of when we're trying to get stuff in Africa, just try and make it work anywhere else. So my directed question to you is, when you couldn't find something that worked inside Kenya, why did you look there? Why did you not look, for example, in South Africa? And I'm not picking on you as an organization. I'm trying to understand what it is that Africans are doing wrong by saying, if I don't want to give my money to somebody in my country because I don't trust the infrastructure here, why am I not doing it to the country next door? By way of example, using a different region in the world, there's a country in the Middle East where it is forbidden in regulation to buy services from the countries that are immediately adjacent to it. I won't mention the name. The regulator gets very upset with me. Starts with O. So I want to know if that kind of mindset is prevalent in the African environments that you're involved in, and what we should be doing to get rid of that, if anything at all.
It's a fair question. So for me, I have a bulk account with DreamHost. It was just next logical step. I've worked with them for years. So for me, it was more of just migrating from what I'm not happy with to what I know and what I've tried and tested for a long time. But I do get your point in terms of even though I don't find a solution within my country, maybe I should look regionally, maybe in Tanzania or Uganda. That is a valid point. But for me right now, it was just because it's the quickest thing. I already have an account with these guys. I'll just migrate very easily.
And I think that's the point. It was the quickest thing. I think, I mean, the internet is the only place that I see Africans not being able to make a solution. Everything else in Africa, we can fix things. We're good at that. In any other industry, we can do that. And on the internet, we don't seem to be able to make things work the right way. And what Ernest said is that it was quicker to get onto that email service, where what we possibly should have done if we had more time is to start looking at creating a service locally that was beneficial or that met your needs. But did you have time? And the thing is, I don't know if we've found our feet yet with the internet. Everything has moved so quickly. It's come upon us so rapidly. Perhaps we're still trying to find our feet.
This is where government should be doing a better job. I'm in Kenya. Every time a foreign government comes to Kenya, whether it be China, USA, UK, they're having huge delegations. They're marketing the technology and selling the tech innovation to Kenya and wanting to invest in these things. Every time a delegation comes from South Africa or whatever, I don't think that's on the agenda. I mean, South Africa is quite a lot more advanced than the rest of Africa in terms of its internet technology and ICT adoption. South African companies are not themselves marketing themselves into Africa all that aggressively or successfully, and the South African government is not doing anything to support. Countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria are perhaps producing quite a lot of tech innovation, tech services that are coming in, and they're doing a reasonably good job of marketing themselves to the rest of Africa. I think one thing we're trying to do through our innovation partnerships is to help scale up stage startups that have got some service that's some electronic service that's relatively successful in whatever country they're coming from, and help them grow across the network we have. We've got a Pan-African network, and we want to help them grow across Africa. And I mean, one simple example here, I've just been off this lunchtime with a Tanzanian company we're working with. They've developed a online newspaper service with Tanzanian newspapers, and we're helping them to grow Pan-African across the network and looking them up through business relationships, cloud connectivity, mobile money, getting them onto an Pan-African platform. And that, it's hard. If you start off, it's hard doing business anywhere in Africa. If you start in some country, it's then quite hard to expand, and particularly if you're coming from the smaller countries like Tanzania, the tech scene isn't so developed. It's quite hard to develop and grow Pan-African. But once you've got to learn Pan-African, you might get Pan-Global, you might get African services going global.
Just 1 second, Amrish. So on that, are we too lazy? Are we too tired? Or are we too greedy? And I think each of those, coming back to what both you and Andrew say, are we too lazy in the sense that the idea of thinking about how to monetize an intangible product like the internet and how can that make big money for me, not small bits, but big money immediately, is that an intimidating idea for Africa? Are we too greedy in that it's easy to sell a physical thing? I can go pluck a mango from a tree, sell it down the street and get some money and feed my kids. Are we too greedy to let a bit of our profit go for the long-term benefit of the region, the company, the country, the continent, and so forth? Do we want to stick to charging high prices for what we know will make money on until it can't anymore and then run out of ideas? And are we just too tired of trying to do all these things because there's no government infrastructure support, there's no legislation, there's overtaxation, et cetera, et cetera? Ben, I know Liquid launched a service, maybe it's last year, the TV service, right? It's Kwesa, isn't it, right? Yeah, so that's obviously an intangible service. Perhaps you can, tell us, how tiresome that has been to develop. And if you think, whatever you've learned from that is something most of Africa doesn't want to have to go through, because maybe like Andrew said, maybe we're just moving too quickly, we're not ready.
Yeah, I've been around 16 years in this company. We've taken quite a while to get to having a lot of countries. It is hard work. Each country you come to is hard to do business. The countries we're talking about are generally in the bottom 100 of the Global Ease of Doing Business Index. It's hard to get going. And we've grown country by country steadily. That TV business you're trying to launch in about 9-10 different countries at the same time, and they've struggled. It's hard. It's very hard to do that. I think that with the infrastructure that we've put down, the internet infrastructure that's there, in combination with mobile money services, I think it can open it up and make it easier. That's when I talked earlier about passport and all that procedure to travel across a border being like the procedure to build a fiber across a border. It's the same, but you only do it once. You only put the infrastructure across the border once, and then packets just flow. So in many ways, it can be easier. I don't think there's laziness, but I think it can be very easy if you're doing well. Maybe, South Africa is a big market, and if you're doing well in South Africa, it might not seem all that interesting to cross the border and go to Zimbabwe, which is struggling economically, and go to Namibia with not that much population, Botswana the same. It might not seem that very interesting to go that way. So maybe if you're sitting in the sun making good wine, you might get into a laziness.
I know that John wants to make a comment, but I just wanted to quickly, before we move on, your question, and the easiest way to answer this, to get an idea of the mindset in South Africa. What did the mobile providers do when WhatsApp came? And what did the broadcasters do when Netflix came? And that goes a long way to explain that.
So from that moment, I think one of the other things that's easy to see is also where the capital flows, the flow of capital. So in Kenya, for instance, I don't know if it's happening in Tanzania, But one of the first things people do when you create a startup, the first thing you try to do is not necessarily raise money locally in Kenya, which, if you think about it, would be the people who support you the most. What happens is the money flows from the outside in. So even the few, at least in my opinion, the few successful companies, content companies or otherwise, we still end up in a situation where the advice you're getting as, let's say, a CTO of a startup for where to go host or for where to get something is always outside the continent, because they know or they already have these relationships there to give you presumably what you need. So I think there's also that other aspect to consider.
Eric.
Yeah, I agree with Andrew on on one point that maybe the internet all happened too fast. And so instead of developing node to node, we just all put those satellite links to Europe, and then right away you had that content there, and there was nothing local. Hussein Darcy, who started Raha, he told me that in the beginning. So Raha was one of the first part. He said his original intention was just to connect people locally. It wasn't to connect the internet. And maybe if he would have gone on with that, but other people came along and put the links. And so when you had Yahoo, instead of just talking to your neighbor, it was sexier, and that's where it went.
We don't talk to our neighbors anyway. Ernest, you want to say anything? Amrish.
Yeah. Just wanted to put some facts based on the study that we did earlier this year at Afrinic. We basically wanted to know where is local content hosted in Africa. No, sorry, from Africa elsewhere. And we basically surveyed like 2,000 news websites. News websites are supposed to contain local content, right? And 90% of them are either hosted in the US or in Europe, and 10% in South Africa, actually. And then we always say 80% of traffic is YouTube now or something. And then we are also seeing products such as iRoko TV from Nigeria and AfroStream. So my question is, what can we do to actually ask them to come and host their products in Africa instead of hosting it elsewhere? I think iRoko is somewhere in London or in France. Okay. So those are the questions. And then maybe another thought. China has banned Facebook and Twitter and whatever. And because of that, you see a boom in the usage of WeChat and Tencent. Obviously, it's a bad solution, but
1 billion people, yeah.
Yeah. Is there African apps that we can push that way? I don't know. But as you said, also Africa is not one country as well. So, yeah.
Africa's got enough problems. Do we want to create problems for ourselves?
So again, this is where I come back and say, regulation is a double-edged sword. If you choose to go this way, then you have to be ready for quite a number of things going wrong initially, probably later too.
So since you've got the microphone and I've got a point here about regulation and what effective regulation would be, my question is about something was mentioned earlier. The fact that when a minister hands you a business card, it says something at yahoo.com. Now, aside from just being a slight on the ministry, that's an incredible cybersecurity gap. So what's missing, and what should we be telling the regulators to fix?
You know, you'll be surprised actually. For most ministers, actually using Gmail or Yahoo to them is safer because nobody local is trying to read what they are doing. A local mail server means Ernest or anyone could be seeing. Well, so flip security and look at it from that other aspect where the guys don't actually trust. Each of these ministries actually probably has a mail server. For instance, in Kenya, I know they all have mail servers, but they won't use them for the most part. And you might be surprised to find that the reason is actually what you just mentioned, security. But from the other side.
But also, it's one of the reasons TZ-NOG was started is because we found that the government people didn't trust their mail servers because they were unreliable. The skill issue.
Right. So you're making my point, which was going to be why aren't we using that opportunity to do? And Eric just made that.
Why are we talking about email? Email is an application that started the internet and was useful at the time. It's a dead application at the moment. There's no future in email. I don't know why we're even debating it.
Because for all people like me, email does one thing that Facebook and Twitter and all of the stuff that's out there these days doesn't actually do. It's ephemeral. It's just gone. But how am I going to learn from a Facebook thread? I'm sorry, I haven't figured that out yet. Or am I going to learn from something that disappears 30 seconds later? But a mailing list is useful because a mailing list can be archived. I know who said what, and I know whether to trust them. So I know that Ben is actually quite smart. So if he says something on a mailing list, yeah, I should probably read it and pay attention to it. And it's there over time. And I think that that's a big problem with the communities. And this is why when we talk about building NOGs, I always tell them the first thing you should do is have a mailing list so people understand what you've done and why it is what you've done.
In more serious answer, if you're hosting, like companies hosting their own email servers and governments hosting their own email servers, it's actually quite hard to host an email server properly and do it well. And the reason that ministers use their Yahoo account is probably that they're important people and they need to have communications on the go and they need to have it there and then right then and need to know it works. And the one they have from the office probably isn't that reliable. The Wi-Fi probably doesn't work. They certainly can't attach their mobile phone to it. They can't bring their own devices. The services that are being run by a lot of companies in Africa are using very old, sometimes unsupported versions of email servers. And ultimately, that is why email went to the Gmail services, the Yahoo services now. But it's moved on now. Now you can have your own domain hosted on Gmail or Microsoft or Office. So that is perhaps the way forwards. But that then is taking the content off of the continent largely.
Okay, so from my perspective, I think we should probably map the nature of the African people to the decisions that we make. So for example, in Tanzania, we have Magufuli, who's doing some amazing work. And when I speak to, I don't know if everybody thinks it's amazing, but when I speak to the cab people and people on the street, and they're all like, yeah, he's ruling with an iron fist, but that's what we need as African people. So maybe we should use that same approach to digital space. Maybe we should create some form of rules or regulation that will force us to, for example, for government institutions, never host your email abroad, keep it local. And that will maybe force the government to set up a centralized data center that will host all the mail for all the different ministries using different domain names, for example, and just keep them organized. So force people to get into a certain frame of mind through this regulation. Amrish was asking about content, Iroko being hosted abroad, the same thing. Ensure that all these content providers and content creators are hosting their content locally through regulation. So force people to do these things, because clearly this is one of the only methods that that work in Africa.
So sorry, if you don't mind me just stepping in, I know that you're going to the next thing. I'm trying to understand this because I'm hearing people say that we want light regulation. I'm a big fan of light regulation, by the way. We're hearing there's cybersecurity gaps and there's a whole bunch of privacy issues that are being abused, and we should perhaps fix this with regulation. And then you're hearing issues like if you don't have a .ccTLD, you're going to go to jail in that country, right? Which is just makes no sense to me at all. But on top of it all, we're hearing one thing, and Andrew's got the mic, so this is good. You're hearing one thing that Andrew is saying, which was the business case for this. This is a fantastic business case in my opportunity. And I'm not a business person, right? This is a fantastic opportunity to say, let me develop something and let me then take it to the local government and say, here you go, you can use this. Why are we not doing that? Why are we still relying on Gmail? And I don't buy that the trust is such an issue, because if you are hosting government mail and you get caught leaking it, there is recourse for the government for what they'll do to you. You'll get thrown in jail. But if Gmail leaks your mail, what are they going to do to Eric? Huh?
Reality, Nisham, my wife, the government in Kenya, and email services don't work all the time. It's the reality is how it is. You know, it is not reliable, and they won't take a large file size. You know, it's the basic service provided by the government that she uses. I won't say what ministry. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's the point I think that I want to make is that
you can sell it.
So the question came up now. What do we need to do better to keep that African content local? And we need to. The infrastructure needs to be better. Stuff is hosted off continent because there's a measure of stability in that. And back to the China thing and back to the regulation thing. There is absolutely no way that you make things better by taking people's choices away.
So, look, I understand the frustration. Email should probably be one of the easiest, most common thing to fix and secure, but I think it goes beyond this. But anyway, back to the main point here. If for me, the way I look at this, if I look at all this spectrum of services and or potential services that could be created, hosted, delivered across Africa through African data centers and things like this. The challenge on us is actually quite immense. If I look at fintech is an area that's actually quite highly regulated. You have a case where if you have a bank in Kenya and you want to launch, let's say, in Tanzania, I think by regulation, you can't use that data center in Kenya. You have to come here, get a whole new servers, everything before you launch here, which, I mean, well, it's good for some business, but it still doesn't make sense to most of these banks that, so instead of them spreading across Africa and offering their services, what ends up happening is they stay local in those countries and never get to go out. I think the same regulation is affecting them when it comes to things like mobile money transfers, etc., etc. So in as much as I advocate for a lot of, or some regulation, I think we should be careful how we utilize it in that regard, as far as I'm concerned.
Maybe in our NOG meetings, we need to add another, what do we call them, streams? And it would be monetizing or data center, management of data centers, you know, or does only Office work for you? Can you sell that? And also bringing people who've made money off of selling content.
Sorry, I still want to go back to, I mean, some of the things that I see being addressed. Bob, for the record, why is it a very good reason and most of the time, so that local hosting solution doesn't work, or maybe, I mean, local servers in government doesn't work, the next solution is to take it abroad. What happened to us insisting that it works? Because I don't think technology is the problem. Why don't we ever insist that it works and still pay for it and ensure that it works as it's supposed to work? I mean, to the point, you flip the security element of it. I think what I would ask, depending on which email you're using, is which government would you rather have looking at it? Because if you have an email address, you are, say, a public servant, and you're saying, you know, for security reasons, I'm not using our local server. The fundamental question is, if you're transacting official business, if I work for ICANN today, I don't think I have a choice which email I should use for ICANN purposes. So what is it that I'm hiding if I'm tracking official business? And which government would you rather have look at it? Because if it can be accessed because it is a local server, then the same applies, because those organizations ultimately are, you know, under some jurisdiction. So I'm not sure if this is a discussion that also happens with these people, but I really feel there's a cultural issue. It doesn't work. The next thing we do is to move. And we actually don't allow failure in Africa. If you're a startup and somehow you encounter challenges, that is it, you know, you're doomed. You must not fail. So what happened to us forcing and insisting that you actually perform?
I mean, so as far as, look, you're right. There are clear cultural issues. And obviously, the fact that it's not working here and you can see a solution elsewhere, and it's so easy to access, it might actually be cheaper in some instances, means people just find it easy. I mean, in Anna's case, I mean, email is not working. I won't even try. I will use someone else. It's not like a car. Well, cars might be like this in the future, but today if my car breaks down, I'll fix it and use it. If my mail server breaks down, I'll leave it alone and use another one. If I can't read news from CNN, I will read from BBC or even my local newspaper's website, which is probably hosted at the same place. That's what it is.
So I've got a question for most of the big operators here. What I would like to know the efforts that you guys are doing to engage government, whether it's through lobbying or getting close to them, because to just stay in our own corner and they are on this other corner, there's just this gap, this dungeon of, distrust, because I think they need help. And sometimes because I think we are government, we shouldn't come to you in public to ask for it. Whether it is the African Union, the African Development Bank, it would really be great. I would like to know what efforts you guys are making to engage governments in order to start getting the right regulation environments in place.
It's a good question. I think that we would certainly try to engage governments and work to what we regard as being important. So the important things for us are the foundation. We look at, regulations to break things we're not interested in, over-regulation. Foundations to, make things right and proper from the foundations up. So data protection laws, cybersecurity laws. We did a policy for an ICT policy for Kenya. I got involved personally and chaired a committee for new and future technologies, which is around some of these things. With what we do, we busy, but we don't actually put in as much money behind it. If we take all the African operators across all of Africa, I doubt that we spend as much money on public policy work as Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon and Google put together. They probably spend far more than all of the African operators, and there's probably 400 African operators, including ISPs, much more. They probably spend far more than we do, and actually having dedicated staff to it. But we at Liquid Telecom, we haven't put as much budget as we ought to, but we focus on the important things.
Do you think that the policies that the Facebooks and the Googles are pushing are impeding what you might be pushing? Is that the implication?
They may not be pushing the policies that are
in our interest,
most needed in Africa. They may be pushing the policies that are most needed by them. For us as an African operator, the most needed policies and regulations are those things I said. It's the rule of law, right? It's data protection law, it is cybersecurity law, it is these things that are the most important. Because if you don't know your data is private, why would you want to host it in any country? You don't get all these rules telling you where and where you can't host it. Unless you know that your data is safe in a country, you're not going to put it there at all. If anybody can turn up and take your data without any law, they can just send a policeman or something and take your data, your hard drives away. We see this. Why would you host in a country that's got no rule of law?
So I'll talk from experience, at least from our market, which is Kenya. One of the challenges had always been the lack of facilities, proper facilities that they are expecting. But thanks to some people like Liquid who set up the EADC, SICOM who have the Mombasa cable landing station, there are people like iColo who are coming in right now. You were seeing that a lot of the content destinations are now coming closer. For example, Facebook are setting up a POP in Mombasa in the next few months in iColo. You will find that we didn't have Microsoft Azure in Africa, but now they've set up a POP in South Africa, I think in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. So most of that traffic, yes, you will see that coming down. And I believe in Google also have presence in Mombasa at the CLS. Now, as those facilities keep coming up and we are marketing them, you start seeing the content coming in much locally, which also brings another issue. Let's talk, for instance, CDNs. You find that most CDNs do not peer with IXPs. They peer directly with IXP peers. And you will find now that is being used as a service differentiator. If we are chasing the same customers. So all you're telling one customer is, listen, I'll give you a better service. I'll give you lower latencies because I am peering somewhere in Amsterdam. I'm peering somewhere in Palermo, like for instance. So somebody says, this other service provider is giving me lower latencies. Now, those competitions mean that everybody is playing catch up in one way or another. So if that stops, then yes, you will start seeing people now not looking at those things and start saying, okay, how do we bring in this content? If somebody has some form of CDN, how do they share that? And let's start enjoying that experience. Because if I hear one service provider has something, you also want to go and get it. Eventually we'll have too much and still the competition will be tight. Those are just my 2 cents on that.
Okay, I think we had more time, but we're just about done. You want to say something?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
I will maybe 2-3 minutes.
I have mainly 2 things. My name is Federico Abibu from the .tz registry, TZNOG organizing committee chairman. I will talk about the issue of engagement with the government. Sometimes we don't have to blame the governments because sometimes there are some opportunities where ourselves we fail to engage. So we need to improve our engagement on our side. Sometimes there are opportunities which we need to take advantage and engage with the government, right? I'm referring to past experience whereby some entities like ISP Association were being invited to discussions of some policies, some regulations, and very few were turning up. So I would request the association like ITISPA to be fully engaged with the government whenever an opportunity comes, so that whatever comes is not a surprise to them and you start complaining. Okay, that is one. Another issue, I will talk about the issue of hosting or the issue of having reliable services within our institutions. Not only the government, even some private institutions. And this basically has been the background on why I'm very much involved in TZNOG capacity building initiatives. You find an institution whereby when they send emails over Gmail, they are sent straight away without any problems. But when they use a local CCTLD through mail servers managed by the local technical guys, the mail is not sent. So what is the problem? Is it the problem of the registry? No, it's the problem of the techies within the local institutions, all right? But in the end, for sure, they will say .tz does not work, but it doesn't mean the registry is down, all right? That is one point. So for sure, there are technical issues within some of the institutions, but also we are somehow lazy because there is an opportunity for affordable capacity building like it is now, but people don't turn up and people don't even support the local institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Abibu. I think just to close off, maybe some parting thoughts from your side on my next statement. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Yahoo, Netflix, Hulu, Alibaba, Tencent, pick your pick. These are not government companies. These are all private companies that started something, failed here and there. This could be their 300th attempt that actually worked. Spent a lot of money, like Ben was saying, lobbying government to install legislation and regulation that supported their business, painful as it is. Continue to do so. Are we perhaps aiming for that kind of scale as Africans? if we're saying that ultimately we shouldn't be waiting for them to come in, we should be facilitating them to come in or creating our own products. Are we looking at that as an example and getting intimidated by how insurmountable that hill might be to climb and saying, you know what, let me not even bother. Someone else will look after it. You know, Ernest will look after the highway. Ben will look after the sea. Andrew will look after the data center. You know, it's not my problem. They will fix it. Someone else will fix it, but not me. Is this the rut we find ourselves in as Africans? Are we too intimidated to dig in and to feel the pain? Are we too afraid to want to feel the pain? Let someone else deal with it. Parting thoughts.
All right. Okay. So I'm not sure whether it's one or a mix of all those things, Mark, you've talked about. But I know for sure at some point, little bits and pieces of everything have to come together to make sure this works. So it's about giving our consumers choice, but also part of that choice being local, to your points, reducing the latency for them, and making sure that they get the best services. Obviously, there's going to be some requirements around regulation. I'm seeing a lot of things around data sovereignty and such like areas, capacity building for our technical people, etc. But something I'm definitely happy to walk the journey with the community.
Yeah, I think we are a bit intimidated. I think, you know, and it's a good word that you used, was insurmountable. But at the same time, I mean, we have a lot of opportunity here. We need to stop expecting things to come here. But at the same time, we shouldn't be intimidated by international companies. You know, this is, you know, as you know, in a peering relationship, for example, it's a two-way street. Nobody's coming to Africa to do us a favor. This is a business transaction. And we need to understand that. And we need to make sure that it is a favorable environment. You know, and a lot of the, I think part of this entire discussion is that a lot of operators are driven by what their users want, right? And I think that's probably why, well, one of the reasons that a lot of these big brand name services are so popular is, or why we're struggling with a lot of them is because that's what people want. So we're going to ask ourselves, why is it not possible for us to do something on the same scale? I mean, you look at the number of things that have come out of Africa, and you know, the things that we've been able to achieve. Why is this any different? Why can't we do it? And then at the same time, why don't we trust each other? You know, we've spoken. I know we used email as an example. It was just, but this applies to everything, not just email. And I just want to add, it was funny the comment that Ben made about email, because he accidentally replied all to a mailing list with a bad comment a few years ago.
We've all done it, yeah.
So yeah, and again, you know, the point is we can do this. We can do this. This is not insurmountable. But you know, we need to start trusting each other. And then I also just want to end off, because I say this a lot, and I say this everywhere. Using regulation to force people to do anything is the quickest way to chase them away. There's no good way that you can implement regulation that forces people to be in your country. This doesn't make sense. And again, as I'll say it again, if you use the China example, you don't take people's choices away.
Okay, so from my perspective, I think that we should view the African content creators, providers as little children. And little children need support. They need to be fed. They need to be clothed. They need to be bathed. And when you look at all these big players, they're post-teenage, they're matured, and they have this strength and ability that the little child doesn't have. So I think our problem is to create an environment, like Andrew said, that's conducive for these little children to thrive, which is fair, it's natural. So that's why I am a proponent of some form of regulation. Look at Uganda and their social media tax. What does that do? I know it sounds ridiculous, but you've given people Facebook, they've enjoyed it, then now you're making it more difficult for them to access it. So what do? They have two choices. Number one, pay the tax, which helps the country, or create your own Facebook, a local one, which will still serve those needs of the people.
Yeah, the regulations are all OTT.
Well,
that's the law. The law is for all OTT.
All right. We can create a method whereby if it's local, then you're not going to tax it. If it's international, then yeah. So I think that that's how I would view regulation, just to create a conducive environment and allow the local little children businesses to thrive. Yes.
Yeah, so I first got on the internet in around 1992, 1993. And it seemed a bit difficult at the time. I worked in a factory. I was developing components, and we needed to access information about the components and what competitors were doing. So we had to persuade our IT manager to let us hook our computer up to the network. He allowed us to have one computer that was more than 6 feet away from all the network computers with a modem, and no other. That computer was not allowed to touch the network or any other things. It seemed hard for us at the time. Eric's been around a while, and I guess it was pretty hard going on the internet in Lithuania and Arusha in 1993. I know a lot of guys who started the first generation of ISPs, and probably had to struggle with all manner of things: expensive satellite dishes, regulation, hiding from regulators, changing regulations, dealing with incumbents, and we've moved on an awful lot from there, right? So now. The challenges that were there have really moved on a lot. Access to cloud computing is very, very easy, and what you can do with cloud computing now, it gives you as much power as a developer in San Francisco, and it doesn't really matter where the cloud is. It doesn't matter if it's in Nairobi, Johannesburg, or in London. You can develop and make applications, and there are things that are there to nurture, as you're saying, like little children, that there are innovation hubs where you can go and you can meet and mingle with other like-minded, entrepreneurial internet geeks, have fast bandwidth access to, there'll be other, there are people investing, there are a whole number of things that you need to start and grow an internet business, and they're here, and it's a lot easier than things were. I know it varies from country to country, but the ecosystems for these are around, and there is no reason to be intimidated anymore.
Yeah, I don't think we're intimidated, and I think we just have to wait a bit. I think it's coming. Yeah, I've come from dial-up store and forward emails over telephone lines, and it was very difficult. And people kept telling me, can't remember the name of the first dial-up company in the U.S. that gone out of business. But they said, they're going to go.
AOL, was it?
Yeah, they're going to go worldwide, and you're going to be dead. And we're still here. When Africa Online came, our one salesperson came back from a meeting crying and said, we better all quit. Where's Africa Online? I think people are going to stick with it, and someday it's going to go. Who thought that Liquid Telecoms would run this network all terrestrial? When I first heard about it, I said, no way. It can't be done. Not yet, but they did it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's quite heavy after a heavy lunch. I think the audience has been great, and so have you, the panel. I think we've all deserved our drink for this evening. I thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you again.